It was a quiet Sunday morning in Austin, Texas. The sun had just begun to stretch across the manicured lawns of Highland Park, a modest but well-maintained public space nestled in a residential neighborhood on the city's northwest side. Dog walkers strolled lazily along the paved path. A jogger passed by, earbuds in, unaware of the discovery that was about to turn a sleepy suburb into the epicenter of a horrifying investigation. Around 7:30 a.m., a sanitation worker named Curtis Malone, 58, was beginning his routine cleanup of the park. For nearly 15 years, Curtis had maintained this area, picking up litter, clearing storm drains, sweeping the paths. He knew every bench, every light pole, and every regular visitor by sight. But this morning, something caught his eye that felt off. Near the tree line by the west parking lot, just off the jogging path, sat a steel drum. It looked industrial, brushed gray metal, boxy, about a foot wide and a little over a foot tall. It had no markings besides some worn tape wrapped tightly around the lid. Curtis assumed it was an abandoned grease container or maybe a chemical canister from one of the nearby food trucks. Still, the placement was strange. Highland Park didn't usually attract illegal dumping. He walked toward the drum, preparing to haul it over to his cart. But when he tried to lift it, the weight shocked him. It was heavy, unnaturally so, and sealed shut. He set it down, puzzled. Something about it didn't feel right. Out of curiosity, he peeled at the edge of the tape. It didn't come off easily. The container had been wrapped layer over layer, using a type of vinyl industrial tape, common in electrical work and corrosion protection. Whoever had sealed this container wanted whatever was inside to stay inside. Curtis managed to pry the top open with a small flathead screwdriver from his utility kit. The moment the lid cracked, a sickening stench surged out like a punch to the gut. It was the unmistakable scent of rot, organic, pungent, and deathly foul. Inside was a human skull. Curtis staggered back in shock, his stomach lurching. He dropped the lid and stumbled several steps away, trying to process what he had just seen. After a few moments of disbelief and panic, he steadied his hands enough to dial 911. Within 15 minutes, Austin police officers arrived on scene. Highland Park was immediately cordoned off with yellow tape. Officers secured the area and began sweeping the surroundings while awaiting the homicide unit and forensic team. The press hadn't yet caught wind, but within the hour, the entire neighborhood would know something terrible had been found. The steel drum was measured and examined on site. It stood about 13 inches tall and had a capacity of roughly 4.8 gallons, just under what's known in Japan as a tow unit, commonly used in industrial settings. Inside, besides the skull, investigators discovered several strands of dark hair, a partial ankle bone, and remnants of plastic wrapping. Initial impressions made one thing clear: this wasn't the disposal of an accident. This was methodical. Whoever had done this had dismembered a body, or perhaps more than one, and carefully sealed it to contain the odor and delay decomposition. The tape used was thick and heat-resistant. The container had no fingerprints. It was a professional job, or at the very least, someone who had done their research. Detectives questioned Curtis on what he had seen. He explained the container wasn't there the previous day. He walked this route every morning and knew what belonged and what didn't. He also mentioned seeing a few early joggers and 2 dog walkers, but no one suspicious. He assumed the container had been dropped off during the night. Later that same day, around 2:15 p.m., a second container, similar in size and design, was discovered in a back alley 2 blocks from the park. This one appeared older and more rusted. It too contained human remains, this time a femur, several ribs, and portions of a spinal column. The next morning, a third container was found behind a shuttered gas station just 100 meters from Highland Park. Though unsealed and dented, it matched the others in dimensions and design. It contained fragmented bones, including pieces of a pelvis and another ankle. Forensic teams worked quickly to assess the contents. After 48 hours of testing, DNA results identified the remains as belonging to 2 people, a woman in her mid-40s and a young adult male in his early 20s. Both were of Caucasian descent. The time of death was estimated to be around 5 years earlier, placing it back in 2006. The case was no longer just about unidentified remains. Now it was about connecting the victims to someone, somewhere, who had lost them, and someone else who had tried to erase them. APD detectives turned to the city's cold case files, combing through missing persons reports from 2006. It didn't take long to find a match. On May 12, 2006, Dr. Richard Coleman had filed a report stating that his wife, Linda Coleman, 46, and their oldest son, Michael, 21, had gone missing. According to the report, Richard had come home from work one day to find them both gone. Clothes were missing. Laptops and phones were gone. There was no note. No goodbye. Richard had told police that he believed Linda had left him after a particularly bitter argument about finances. He mentioned that she had grown resentful of his job loss and that their son had recently dropped out of college due to unpaid tuition. At the time, officers had investigated briefly, but the lack of signs of foul play and the presence of a second adult who could have left voluntarily led them to close the case. But now, 5 years later, the remains of Linda and Michael Coleman had been found, stuffed into industrial containers, hidden for years, and dumped just a few blocks from Richard's new apartment. When detectives paid Dr. Richard Coleman a visit, he appeared calm, perhaps even detached. Now 57 years old, he was no longer working. He lived alone in a one-bedroom rental just across from Highland Park, the very place where the first container had been discovered. When questioned about the containers, Richard denied knowing anything about them. He said he walked the park often, but had never seen or touched such drums. He admitted to reporting his wife and son missing years earlier, but insisted he had no knowledge of their deaths. His demeanor was unreadable, quiet, controlled, and oddly flat. But something wasn't right. The evidence was stacking up, and the man who once said he had no idea where they went was now living steps from where their bones had resurfaced. The results came back 2 days later. DNA testing had confirmed what investigators had quietly suspected. The remains inside the steel drums belonged to two people, Linda Coleman, aged 46 at the time of death, and her son, Michael Coleman, who had just turned 21. It was no longer a missing persons case. It was a double homicide. In the summer of 2006, Linda and Michael had simply vanished. No phone calls. No financial activity. No sightings. Their disappearance was filed by Richard Coleman, husband and father, who claimed they had packed up and left after a long-running marital conflict. At the time, police had little to work with. No signs of violence. No indication of foul play. It was the kind of case that quietly collected dust like so many others. But now, 5 years later, their bones had surfaced. Hidden in metal drums, sealed tight, and discarded near the very place Richard now called home. The Coleman family had once lived in a 2-story brick house in the Brentwood neighborhood of Austin. It was an upper-middle-class community, well-trimmed lawns, good schools, quiet streets. Richard had been a professor of pharmaceutical chemistry at the University of Texas and later worked for a biotech startup. Linda was a homemaker, known for her involvement in the PTA and church groups. Michael, the eldest son, was described as bright and ambitious, a mechanical engineering student with a full scholarship to a private university. To outsiders, they looked like the ideal family. But inside the Coleman home, pressure was mounting. In early 2006, Richard had lost his job after the company he worked for failed to secure a federal research grant. He had tried to hide the financial strain, but the truth seeped through. Linda began selling items on Craigslist. Michael's tuition payments started bouncing. The family's savings began to evaporate. Then came the rumors of Richard's gambling. Neighbors had seen him at the poker tables in downtown clubs, often late at night. Linda reportedly confided in a friend that her husband was hiding debt and drinking more heavily. Arguments became frequent, some loud enough for neighbors to overhear through open windows. Still, no one expected violence. Not in that house. Not from Richard Coleman. When he reported Linda and Michael missing in May of that year, he had calmly explained that they left after a heated argument. They needed space, he said. They took clothes, their laptops, and just walked out. When police visited the home, they found exactly what Richard had described. The closets were half empty. 2 suitcases missing. Nothing broken. Nothing bloody. The case was logged. A few follow-up calls were made. Then it faded. Now, in the fluorescent-lit halls of the Austin Homicide Unit, those dusty case files were reopened. The officers who had first interviewed Richard in 2006 now found themselves combing over their old notes with a different lens, this time looking for what they had missed. Detectives visited the Coleman home once again, now owned by a new family. With permission, a full forensic sweep was conducted. Using luminol spray, they tested the upstairs bedrooms. In what used to be Michael's room, they found traces of blood in the floorboards, faint, but still detectable. The splatter pattern suggested a blunt force trauma. More blood was found under the bathroom tiles, later confirmed by DNA as belonging to Linda. It was clear now, whatever had happened to the Colemans, it didn't happen somewhere far away. It had happened inside that house. Back at the station, investigators revisited Richard's original statement. They noted its calm, its cold efficiency. He had offered no emotion. No tears. No urgency. Just facts, delivered like a man turning in his taxes. What stood out now wasn't just what he had said, but what he hadn't. He never asked the police to search for them. He never called back to follow up. He never posted flyers, never asked friends to help. In the 5 years that followed, he never once mentioned their names in public again. To the neighbors, Richard's behavior after the disappearance had been strange, but not overtly alarming. He stayed in the house another year before quietly selling it and moving into a small apartment near Highland Park. He told people he preferred the simplicity. He told others Linda had run off with another man. One neighbor recalled seeing him throw out several large boxes just before the move. They were heavy, she said. He had to drag them across the lawn. Detectives brought Richard Coleman in for questioning. When asked directly about the steel drums, he shook his head. "I don't know anything about that," he said. "I walk in that park every morning. I've never seen those containers." When asked about the DNA confirmation, he nodded slowly. "Then I suppose they're really gone," he murmured. His expression never changed. Richard insisted he had no involvement in their deaths. "I came home one day and they were just gone," he said again. "I thought they left me." When pressed further, he offered a story no one expected. According to Richard, when he returned home from work on the night of April 10, 2006, he found the house dark and silent. No dinner on the table. No noise upstairs. He called out, no answer. Then, in Michael's room, he claimed to have found his son's lifeless body lying on the bed. Blood was pooled around his head. A sledgehammer lay on the floor nearby. In the bathroom, he said, Linda's body was sprawled on the tiles. Her wrist had been slashed with a shard of broken mirror. He believed she had killed their son, then taken her own life. When asked why he didn't call the police, Richard offered only one answer. "I didn't want Ben to know." Ben was their youngest son, 14 at the time, on a school camping trip the night of the murders. "I couldn't let him come home to that. I couldn't let that be the last memory of his family." And so, Richard claimed he made a choice. He dismembered the bodies, placed them in metal drums, and stored them in the warehouse of his former biotech company, where he still had access. For 3 years, he said, they remained hidden there. When the company shut down in 2009, he retrieved the containers and brought them home. But when his apartment became too cramped and the guilt too much, he dumped them, one by one, near Highland Park. It was a story no one wanted to believe. And yet, it somehow explained everything. Almost everything. There were still holes. Still lies. Still shadows. Why the dismemberment? Why the industrial tape? Why the 5-year silence? And if his story was true, why didn't he at least bury them? Investigators left the interview unsettled. Richard Coleman was either the most guilt-ridden father in Texas, or the most cold-blooded liar they'd ever encountered. The truth remained buried, but not for long. Brentwood Street runs quiet in the late afternoons. The kind of neighborhood where wind chimes murmur on porches, kids play basketball in driveways, and people know their neighbors' names. At number 4117, behind a mailbox rusted at the corners, stood the former Coleman residence, a 2-story brick colonial with pale green shutters and a modest lawn. The paint had faded. The flower beds were overgrown. But even after 5 years, it still looked like a place where a family once lived. Now, it was part of a homicide investigation. When the forensic team re-entered the property with the permission of the new owners, they brought with them luminol spray and UV flashlights. The new occupants, a couple in their 30s, had no idea the house had been linked to a disappearance, let alone a murder. In the upstairs bedroom, what had once been Michael's room, faint patterns emerged under the blue light. Blood splatter, neatly cleaned, but not gone. It had soaked into the cracks between the floorboards, seeping beneath the hardwood, marking the ghost of a moment no one could see with the naked eye. The bathroom told a similar story. Under the sink, inside the drain, and behind the molding on the baseboard, traces of blood. DNA confirmed it belonged to Linda Coleman. This wasn't a spontaneous disappearance. It wasn't even a sudden one. It was a violent event that had taken place quietly, then carefully buried. But perhaps the most disturbing discovery came not from the bloodstains, but from what wasn't there. There were no signs of a struggle. No overturned furniture. No shattered glass. No signs of forced entry. Just blood in the places it shouldn't have been. The theory taking shape was grim. Linda and Michael had died inside this house. Likely at the hands of someone they trusted. Likely someone they lived with. And only one person fit that description, Dr. Richard Coleman. But he still denied killing them. To the police, Richard maintained the same account, that he had come home, found them both dead, and in a state of shock, chose to hide the incident from his youngest son, Ben. "I didn't want him to live with that image," he said again. "It would have destroyed him." But if grief had been the motivation, it didn't show. The deeper the investigation went, the colder Richard Coleman seemed. Former coworkers described him as intelligent, focused, yet emotionally detached. A man of science, not sentiment. He was respected but not well-liked. Punctual but never warm. He drank alone at conferences. He snapped at lab assistants. He rarely spoke about his family. Yet in one interview, a colleague recalled something chilling. It was back in 2006, only a month after Linda and Michael disappeared. Richard had been working late in the lab. The topic of loss came up. Another employee had just lost her husband. And Richard, staring down at a Bunsen burner, muttered, "If I ever lost my family, I don't know what I'd do. Probably fall apart completely. Or maybe I'd just start over." The comment hadn't meant much at the time. But now, in context, it sounded more like a confession than a reflection. Detectives began reconstructing the timeline. April 10, 2006. Richard says he came home from work around 7 p.m. The house was dark. No dinner on the stove. No sounds. According to his statement, he discovered Michael's body in the bedroom. Blunt force trauma. Nearby, a sledgehammer, partially wrapped in a towel. Then Linda. In the bathroom, wrists slashed with a broken mirror. He claimed she must have killed Michael, then herself. But no suicide note was ever found. No prints on the shard of glass. No blood on her hands. No trail between the rooms. And crucially, number 911 call. No ambulance. No attempt at help. Instead, Richard told police he panicked. He wrapped the bodies in plastic and carried them, piece by piece, to the garage. There, he dismembered them using an electric saw purchased 2 weeks earlier from a hardware store on Lamar Boulevard, paid for in cash. He then placed the body parts into 4 industrial-grade steel drums, containers he said were left over from an old pharmaceutical project. He sealed them with tape and foil, packed them in moving boxes, and drove them at night to the warehouse of his former company, BioNexus Laboratories. He kept them there for nearly 3 years. When BioNexus went bankrupt in 2009, Richard returned, retrieved the drums, and brought them to his apartment near Highland Park. In 2011, just before the building was due for inspection, he decided it was time to get rid of them. He claimed he didn't know why he kept them so long. "I couldn't let them go," he said. "I wasn't ready to say goodbye." To many, it didn't add up. One detective later described it like this: "We weren't just looking at a man trying to protect his son. We were looking at someone who had practiced detachment for years. He didn't panic, he planned." And what about Ben? The youngest son, now in his mid-20s, had been living in another city, working in construction. He had cut off contact with his father shortly after graduating high school. When investigators reached out, he seemed reluctant to revisit the past. But when told about the discovery of the drums, he agreed to talk. Ben described his father as strict, distant, and emotionally unavailable. He said Linda was the one who made birthday cakes, helped with homework, sat through school plays. Michael was the golden boy, athletic, confident, admired. Ben, in contrast, had always felt like the shadow child. After they disappeared, he recalled, Dad just said they were gone. He didn't seem surprised. Didn't cry. Just kept making dinner like nothing happened. He remembered feeling numb. Then guilty for not feeling more. Then angry. I thought maybe they left because of me, he said. Maybe I wasn't enough to keep them around. For years, Ben lived with that silence. It filled every call, every holiday, every room he walked into alone. Now that silence had a name. And it had bled into the floorboards of Brentwood Street. The picture was growing clearer, but the questions remained. Why didn't Richard just call the police? Why go to such lengths to hide the deaths of the people he claimed to love? And most importantly, was it possible he was still lying? Because there was one steel drum still unaccounted for. Only 3 had been found. The 4th had disappeared. 3 drums were found. 3 steel containers, hidden in plain sight, dumped across different corners of Austin. Each one sealed. Each one packed with care. Each one bearing human remains that told the story of a tragedy that had been buried, literally, for 5 years. But there was supposed to be a 4th. That's what Richard Coleman had told investigators. According to his confession, he had dismembered 2 bodies, his wife Linda and son Michael, and placed the remains into 4 drums, not 3. He had stored them for years, and when guilt or fear, or both, finally caught up with him, he tried to dispose of them one by one. Only 3 were ever recovered. The 4th? It was gone. And no one, not even Richard, seemed to know where it went. This was where the case shifted again, from murder and concealment to something even more unnerving. Incomplete truth. Detectives combed through surveillance footage from the time the drums had been discovered. In one grainy clip from a nearby intersection, dated August 12, 2011, just days before the first drum was found, a small flatbed pickup truck could be seen circling the neighborhood near Highland Park at around 2:40 a.m. It stopped near the east entrance of the park, idled for a minute, then turned off-screen. Another clip from the rear of a self-service car wash, just 2 blocks from Richard's apartment, showed what appeared to be the same truck. Only this time, there were 4 people inside, 3 men and 1 woman. The footage was blurry, the license plate unreadable, and the timestamp broken. But it was enough to raise suspicion. Had someone else found the remaining drum? Was it stolen? Or had it been deliberately taken? And if so, why? Police issued a call to the public, asking for tips about any suspicious activity involving a gray pickup in the area between August 10th and August 15th. They also visited junkyards, scrap metal dealers, and industrial waste facilities, hoping someone had seen or handled a drum fitting the description. But nothing surfaced. Then came a theory, one that detectives didn't like, but couldn't ignore. What if Richard never disposed of the 4th drum at all? What if he was lying, again? What if whatever was in that last drum was something he didn't want anyone to find? It wasn't just about human remains. It could be evidence. A weapon. A note. A phone. Something that contradicted the story he'd so carefully built. In his statement, Richard claimed the 4th drum contained the rest of Linda. That was how he put it. Cold. Mechanical. The rest of Linda. But forensic examiners weren't so sure. The DNA results showed that the parts already recovered accounted for most of Linda's body. Not all, but most. That left open the possibility that the missing drum didn't contain just her remains, or perhaps not hers at all. The possibility was troubling. Could there have been a 3rd victim? Investigators reviewed every missing persons report from the Austin area in 2006. They looked for patterns, links, anything unusual. Only one case stood out. A 22-year-old woman named Angela Reyes had gone missing in April of that year, around the same time Linda and Michael vanished. Angela had worked part-time at a gas station off Lamar Boulevard. Her last shift ended on April 9th. She never returned home. Her car was found in a parking lot 2 days later, keys still in the ignition. No connection to the Colemans was ever established. No proof she had even met them. But one thing nagged at detectives. Angela's older brother, Carlos, had worked at Bionexus Laboratories for a few months in early 2006 as a delivery driver. He was laid off shortly after Richard Coleman left the company. Could Richard have known Angela through her brother? Could he have run into her somehow? Could she have known something, seen something? The line of inquiry was speculative. But in a case where the main suspect had already admitted to dismembering and storing 2 bodies in his garage, speculation felt justified. When asked again about the 4th drum, Richard grew vague. "I must have dumped it near the river," he said once. Or maybe by the tracks off 183. "I can't remember." Other times, he claimed he had thrown it in a dumpster. A construction site. It got picked up. Probably gone by now. The inconsistencies weren't just frustrating, they were intentional. Investigators began to suspect that Richard wanted the mystery to remain. That he needed one piece of the story to stay hidden, either out of shame, fear, or something else entirely. Then came another development. 2 months after Richard's second arrest, a local pharmacist came forward with a strange account. He said that Richard had been a customer for years, quiet, polite, always paying in cash. But back in July 2011, just weeks before the drums were discovered, Richard had walked into the pharmacy with a woman. She was younger, maybe late 20s, with dark eyes and a tattoo on her left wrist. They didn't speak much. She paid for a bottle of peroxide and latex gloves. The pharmacist remembered it clearly because of the odd pairing. When shown old photographs, he pointed to Angela Reyes. Detectives were stunned. If the sighting was accurate, it would mean Angela had been alive 5 years after she went missing and seen with Richard Coleman. But it also complicated everything. Was Angela a victim or a collaborator? Had she known about the drums? Helped move them? Been involved in the cover-up? Or was she the one person who could expose Richard's full truth and paid the price for it? The 4th drum loomed large now, not just as a missing object, but as a symbol. It represented the part of the story Richard wouldn't tell. The final chapter he had sealed up and tossed into the world, hoping no one would ever open it. And so far, no one had. To this day, the 4th drum has never been found. Whether it lies at the bottom of a landfill, rusting in a forgotten junkyard, or hidden in the walls of a storage unit, no one knows. But detectives still believe that whatever was inside it could have changed the entire case. And maybe, just maybe, someone else out there knows where it is. The case had stalled. 3 drums were found. 1 was still missing. Richard Coleman sat in a county holding cell, refusing to speak further. The public had grown restless. The press speculated endlessly about motives, mental illness, possible accomplices. But none of it felt solid. Then, on a rainy Tuesday in March of 2013, a package arrived at the Austin Police Department. There was no return address. Just a brown padded envelope, postmarked from somewhere in Louisiana. Inside was a standard USB drive, unmarked, along with a folded note containing only 3 words, printed in bold capital letters. He lied again. At first, the drive was assumed to be another tip, the kind that trickled in after every news segment, usually full of theories or false claims. But this one was different. The file it contained was a video, titled simply, April 12, 2006. It was roughly 19 minutes long. Grainy. Low resolution. The footage showed a man sitting at a wooden kitchen table. The timestamp in the corner matched the title. The kitchen was small, recognizably the same layout as the Coleman home on Brentwood Street. The man in the frame, Richard Coleman. He looked tired. His eyes were puffy, face unshaven. A bottle of scotch stood open beside him, next to a used tumbler glass. He spoke slowly. At first to no one. Then directly to the camera. "I messed up. I didn't mean to, not both of them. It was supposed to be a scare. Just a scare. You push someone too far and they snap." The next few moments were difficult to watch. He described the argument that had erupted that night, April 10th, over money, over Michael's tuition, over the insurance policy Linda had canceled without telling him. He admitted he'd been drinking. He said Linda called him a failure, that Michael had shouted at him to calm down. That the yelling didn't stop. I had the hammer because I'd been fixing the shelving in the garage. I don't even remember swinging it. I just remember the sound. The blood. And Michael's eyes. He paused. Long enough that investigators watching the footage later thought the file had frozen. Linda screamed. She ran. I didn't mean to hit her. Not like that. I just didn't want her to call the cops. It all happened too fast. He took a long sip from the glass. I cleaned it up. Took the bodies to the garage. I told Ben they had left. I told myself it was over. But I knew it wasn't. He then mentioned the drums. How he'd used them at BioNexus before. How he knew they could be sealed tight enough to hide the smell. How easy it had been to access the warehouse, to push the boxes into a corner where no one would look. But it was the final moments of the video that changed everything. Richard leaned into the camera, face filling the frame. I told you I'd take the fall if anything ever happened. But I can't do it forever. Ben, if you're seeing this, I'm sorry. I really am. I just wanted to protect you. But this lie, it's too big now. He looked away for a moment, eyes blinking back tears. I'm going to tell them it was you. That I came home and found the bodies. That you ran. Maybe they'll believe me. Maybe they won't. But at least one of us gets to walk away. Then the screen went black. No signature. No further explanation. Just silence. Investigators sat frozen. For 7 years, the narrative had shifted back and forth. Victim, killer, cover-up, madness. But this was the first irrefutable admission of guilt from the suspect's own mouth. And yet, the question of who sent it loomed even larger. Only one person could have possessed that video, Ben Coleman. He had been 14 years old when his mother and brother were killed. He'd grown up with the belief that they had abandoned him. That his father, for all his flaws, had been left behind just like him. Now, it appeared the truth had been with him all along. The envelope had no fingerprints. The USB was generic, mass-produced. The package was dropped into a mail slot, not handed over. Whoever had sent it had taken every precaution to stay anonymous. But the handwriting on the note, the words, "He lied again," was immediately recognized by investigators. A match to old birthday cards stored during the original case. The same blocky capitals used by a teenager signing Ben under a cake drawing. Ben had sent the tape. But that part wasn't clear. Maybe guilt. Maybe closure. Or maybe, after watching his father try to escape justice a second time, he realized silence was no longer acceptable. When questioned, Ben at first denied everything. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I found the tape in his desk. After I left for college, I came back to visit once. He was asleep. I took it and never said a word." When asked why he waited so long, he hesitated. "I didn't want to be the reason he went to prison. But I also didn't want to be the reason he got away with it." The video was enough. Richard Coleman was officially indicted on 2 counts of first-degree murder. The prosecution now had more than circumstantial evidence. They had a confession. In court, the defense argued that the video was taken under duress, that Richard had been suicidal, intoxicated, mentally unstable. But the jury watched the footage 3 times. Each time, the courtroom was silent. The emotion was real. So was the planning. So was the guilt. Richard Coleman was found guilty and sentenced to life without parole. He never looked at Ben during the verdict. Ben, sitting in the back row, simply nodded. No tears. No smile. Just release. Years later, in an interview, Ben would say, "There are things you can survive. Even things you thought would kill you. But silence rots from the inside." Ben Coleman never went back to the house on Brentwood Street. After his father's conviction, he moved again, this time to Colorado, taking a job as a maintenance worker at a ski lodge outside of Aspen. No one there knew his last name. No one asked. And he didn't offer. For years, Ben had been the forgotten child in a family that looked perfect on the outside but had fractured quietly from within. His mother, Linda, had adored his older brother Michael. At least, that's how it felt to Ben growing up. Michael was the achiever, the one with a full scholarship, the one who got the attention, the one who never disappointed. Ben had always lived in that shadow. Quiet, introspective, not particularly gifted in school or sports, he had learned to fade into the background. To observe. To survive. When his mother and brother disappeared in 2006, no one asked how he was doing. Not the neighbors. Not the teachers. Not even the police. Everyone accepted the story that Linda had left with Michael after an argument. And Richard, stoic, composed, played the role of the abandoned husband. He told everyone he was holding it together for Ben. He cooked dinner, helped with homework, paid bills. On the surface, he was functioning. But behind closed doors, things were different. There were stretches of silence that lasted hours. Ben remembered nights when his father wouldn't speak a word, when the only sound in the house was the clink of a fork against a plate. He remembered asking once, just once, if they would ever hear from Mom or Michael again. Richard didn't look up. He said, "People make choices. You'll learn that one day." So Ben learned to stop asking. At school, he kept to himself. He didn't go to prom, didn't join clubs, didn't invite anyone over. He got a part-time job at a hardware store, graduated, and moved out the day he turned 18. No goodbye. No family dinner. Just silence. He lived in motels for a while. Then shared apartments. Then vans. He changed jobs often. Cashier, janitor, dish pit, freight loader. He preferred night shifts. Fewer people. Less small talk. For a time, he believed he had put it all behind him. That he had escaped the gravity of the Coleman house. But the truth has a way of sticking. Years later, when he found the tape in his father's drawer, tucked under old tax forms and expired documents, something in him shifted. Watching Richard speak into the camera, hearing him say those words, that confession, it was like someone had unzipped the past and poured it all over him again. Ben never said a word to his father. He took the USB, left the next morning, and didn't return. But from that day on, he couldn't sleep right. He couldn't eat without tasting something metallic. And every time he looked in the mirror, he saw his father's eyes staring back. When he finally mailed the video to the police, it wasn't out of vengeance. It was out of necessity, because silence had become too heavy. After the trial, reporters tried to find him. They sent emails, letters. One even showed up at the garage where he briefly worked in New Mexico. But Ben refused all interviews. He wasn't interested in book deals, documentaries, or public sympathy. He just wanted to disappear. Still, pieces of his life had been left behind. Linda's old friend, Deborah Shaw, still kept a photo of the Coleman family in her wallet. Taken in 2002, during a backyard barbecue, Linda in a floral apron, Michael holding a frisbee, Richard wearing sunglasses, and little Ben tucked into the corner, half smiling. It was the last time she saw all four of them together. "He was such a quiet boy," she told a local journalist. "Always clinging to his mom's sleeve. I don't think anyone ever really saw him." That invisibility became his armor. But as the years passed, the shadows followed. A therapist who briefly treated Ben in Colorado noted in sealed court documents that he suffered from complex PTSD, survivor's guilt, and deep identity detachment. He struggled to connect with others. He avoided mirrors. He kept his last name hidden on every form. And yet he wasn't angry. When asked, once, off the record, what he felt about his father's sentence, he simply said, "He wasn't always a monster. But he made a choice. And that choice killed the rest of us." The court never pressed charges against Ben. There was no evidence he had been involved in the crime or the cover-up. But for him, the punishment had always been internal. He had lived 14 years believing his mother and brother had abandoned him. Then another 7 knowing that the man who stayed had taken them away. Meanwhile, the Coleman house was renovated and sold to a new family. The kitchen was repainted. The floorboards replaced. The garage converted into a home office. But even after the remodel, some visitors said it still felt cold. Not haunted, just heavy. Like the walls had learned to keep secrets too. The 3 recovered drums were eventually destroyed after the trial, following evidence retention protocol. But the 4th drum, the one that was never found, remains an open chapter. Some say it's buried. Others believe it was destroyed. One theory, quietly whispered in online forums, suggests that Ben himself may have found it before the police did and gotten rid of it for good. When asked about it once, Ben shrugged. There's always going to be one piece missing. And maybe that's the point. In 2020, a documentary filmmaker tracked down the pharmacist who had once served Richard and Angela Reyes, the girl who had disappeared and was possibly connected to the case. The pharmacist remembered seeing them together just weeks before the drums were found. But Angela's fate remains unknown. No further evidence was ever found linking her to the Colemans. Her case remains open. Her name sits quietly on the Texas Missing Persons Registry. No picture. No updates. Just the word, unresolved. Much like the entire story. Because even with a conviction, a confession, and a video that should never have existed, what lingered most wasn't justice. It was absence. The kind that doesn't scream. The kind that settles into the corners of a life, like dust you never quite wipe away. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes, it arrives in silence. Not in the form of sirens or headlines, but in stillness. In the soft understanding that the storm has passed, even if the debris remains. Richard Coleman died in prison in the spring of 2022. According to the warden at Franklin Correctional Facility in Texas, he passed in his sleep from heart failure. No family visited. No obituary was published. His remains were cremated and stored in an unclaimed locker near Huntsville. There was no ceremony. No words. Just the quiet end of a man who had kept too many secrets for too long. When notified, Ben Coleman declined to claim the ashes. The case of the Coleman family faded from public view not long after. The documentaries slowed. The reporters moved on. New crimes, new tragedies, new names to remember. But for those involved, the story never really ended. Detective Maria Ellison, the lead investigator who had reopened the case in 2011, kept a copy of the confession video locked in a personal safe. Not as evidence, her job was done. But as a reminder. It wasn't just a murder case, she said in a rare interview. It was a portrait of decay. Of how a family breaks down, not in an instant, but inch by inch. Day by day. Until no one remembers how the silence started. She later retired and became a lecturer at a university, teaching criminal psychology. The Coleman file became part of her coursework. Not because of its brutality, but because of its emotional complexity. A case where the motives weren't greed or lust or rage, but fear, shame, pride, and ego. Human things. Too human. The house on Brentwood Street sold again in 2023. The new owners stripped it down to the studs. They replaced the floors, redid the kitchen, and added a small sunroom at the back. Children now play in the yard. A dog barks at squirrels along the fence line. No one who lives there now knows what the house once held. And maybe that's for the best. But those who remember say that sometimes when the wind shifts, the place still feels hushed. Like it's waiting. Or remembering. And what about the missing drum? It was never found. Not in the rivers. Not in landfills. Not in anonymous storage units. Some believe it's gone for good. Others think someone, maybe Ben, maybe not, destroyed it to protect a truth darker than anyone was ready for. The theories never end. That Angela Reyes was the fourth victim. That Richard had a third child. That there were other tapes. That Ben knew more than he ever said. But maybe the missing drum is more than a piece of evidence. Maybe it's a symbol. The part of the story that resists closure. A reminder that some questions don't get answered. That not all endings are clean. Ben Coleman hasn't spoken publicly since the trial. He now works maintenance at a lakeside resort near Whitefish, Montana. Staff describe him as polite, distant, keeps to himself. He reads a lot, mostly books on silence, trauma, and memory. A local librarian said he once asked for a book on how to forget. But forgetting isn't easy. One summer evening, a young guest at the lodge got locked out of their room. Ben came to unlock the door. The girl, maybe 9 or 10, asked if he was a ghost. He smiled and said, "Not quite." That's the most anyone has heard him say in years. Sometimes, people leave behind more than bodies. They leave questions, gaps, memories that change shape with time. And in the case of the Coleman family, what remained wasn't just a broken home, or sealed containers, or courtroom testimonies. It was something deeper. A lesson, perhaps. About what silence does to a family. About the weight of secrets. About how easily love can become pressure, and pressure can become something much worse. There was no moment of resolution. No neat bow to tie things up. No single image that could explain it all. Just stillness. The kind that settles when truth, finally, has been spoken, however late, however painful. In Highland Park, where it all began, there's now a small flower bed near the tree line. Maintained by local volunteers. No plaque. No names. Just a quiet gesture. Most people walk past without noticing. But those who notice, they remember the drums. The park tape. The morning news anchor saying words like remains and homicide, while sprinklers turned on in the background. And they remember that for 5 years, no one asked what happened to Linda and Michael. They were just gone. Until they weren't. At the end of every storm, there's a calm. But not every calm brings peace. Sometimes it just brings space. Space for grief to be felt. For guilt to settle. For truth to echo a little longer in the dark. And for the life that was left behind to start again, even if it never truly heals. Because that's what survival looks like. Not perfection. Not closure. Just continuation.